of critical importance. Exodus chapter 25 verse 9 continues by saying, according to all that I show thee. Right? Let's hibernate the thought there. God says, according to all that I show thee. Let me ask a question. Where did God have this theory of the sanctuary? And remember now that we're asking the Old Testament. Remember, we're busy with the book of Exodus. So we're asking now the Old Testament about, on to say, does it recognize the sanctuary? Remember, 3 ways. So, where does God take this theory or this doctrine of the sanctuary? You see, there's something that we need to understand and acknowledge. God is the sanctuary himself. Remember that in the book of 1 Corinthians, it says that this body is the temple of God. And the temple, as we are going to digest, the temple is the what? Is the naos, is the inner shrine of God. Right? And this temple is not only the temple, it is the sanctuary. God dwells amongst his people. God himself is the sanctuary. The significance and the importance of the sanctuary, as we are going to digest, we are actually going to acknowledge of how God is the sanctuary. Hence he says, build me a sanctuary so that I may dwell amongst you. Right? Here we acknowledge God saying that according to the pattern that I show thee. Right? And that pattern, where is it from? There is no other doubt. When God said, let them build me a sanctuary so that I may dwell amongst thee, he wanted the earthly sanctuary. But hibernate that thought. We're going to ask the Bible, what does it have to say about the sanctuary? And here we acknowledge that God also has a sanctuary in heaven, because he is the sanctuary. Right? Exodus continues by saying, after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall ye make it. Right? And so God instruct Moses on how he's supposed to actually build the sanctuary. Right? According to the pattern that I show you. And that's the same pattern that's founded where? In heaven. Right? Let's continue on asking the Old Testament about the doctrine of the sanctuary. Exodus chapter 40 verse 19 says, and he spread abroad the tent over the tabernacle and put the coverings of the tent above upon it, as the Lord commanded Moses. Here we acknowledge that there's another word that signifies or implies the sanctuary. It's the word tabernacle. Here we acknowledge that the Bible, there is no doubt that it calls it 3 times. It calls it in 3 ways, but signifying the same thing or portraying the same thing. As I've said, 1, it's the sanctuary of God. 2, it's the tabernacle of God. 3, it's called the temple of God. Right? And interestingly enough, the word temple in Hebrew has 2 words. The first word is hieron, right? And the second word is naos. But let's digest on the word hieron. The word hieron actually simply means the totality of the temple, from one corner to another corner, from one end to the end, from the other end to another end. That's the word hieron. Now, the word naos simply means the most selected, the inner shrine, the most holy place, the holies of all. Right? The naos of God. The true inner shrine of God. This is now the selected temple of them all. Right? And let's continue on the book of Exodus chapter 40 verse 20 now. And he took and put the testimony into the ark. Right? So God gives Moses the instructions on how he was supposed to build. And interestingly enough, we see that God also gave him instruments. As we're about to digest, you'll actually acknowledge. He gives him instruments on to say, when you are done building the sanctuary, there are some instruments or there are some equipment or furniture that I want you to install where in the sanctuary. Right?